From today, you'll take care of the three of us. If you don't want to, then I'll make sure you divorce Ethan. It's your choice. Either take care of us or get a divorce. Ethan's mother and sister Madison suddenly showed up at my house and gave me an ultimatum. Either take care of them or divorce Ethan. I was stunned. While I was in a state of panic, my husband Ethan didn't seem fazed at all by their unexpected visit. Well, I guess we have no choice. Don't worry, we'll take care of you. Ethan didn't even hesitate, making me wonder if he had known they were coming all along. As I stood there speechless, Madison smirked and started talking. Maggie, you married into an elite family by getting together with Ethan. There's no way you'd actually go through with a divorce. You don't even have any family to fall back on. Without Ethan, you wouldn't survive. As Madison spoke, Ethan's mom, Sandra, chimed in with a triumphant smile. Exactly. Maggie could never go through with a divorce. Deciding on their own that I would leave Ethan, Sandra and Madison made themselves comfortable in our living room. Ethan didn't even bother asking me how I felt about it. It seemed like divorce wasn't even a possibility in his mind. Once I finally calmed down a little, I answered them. All right then, let's go with the divorce. When I said that, Ethan and his mom both looked completely shocked. Thinking they might not have understood me, I repeated myself. I've made up my mind. I'm going to divorce Ethan and move out of this house, so you all can live together however you want. Ethan blinked in disbelief, clearly caught off guard by my unexpected words. What? No way. Are you serious about divorcing me? Sandra looked equally stunned, but Madison, as usual, seemed completely unfazed. You're throwing away the chance to be part of our elite family. What a waste. Don't come crying later when you regret it. Seeing Madison's smug expression reminded me that I needed to contact Connor about this. I had completely forgotten to call him because of Sandra and Madison's sudden intrusion. Determined to leave, I went to my room to start packing my belongings. I picked up the phone and called Connor. Connor was Madison's ex-husband, and he has some personal matters to settle with Sandra. Thanks for letting me know. I figured they showed up there. Connor arrived shortly after, out of breath and visibly angry. Oh, Connor, what are you doing here? Sandra looked even more surprised than when I had said I wanted a divorce. Madison, who had been holding the baby, also fell silent, hearing Sandra's startled voice. Sandra, disappearing without saying anything was out of line. We're going to have a proper conversation today. When Connor said that, Sandra turned pale and retreated to Madison's side. Ethan stepped in to respond to Connor instead. Connor, calm down. Mom knows she made a mistake, all right? Ethan's attempt to de-escalate the situation didn't faze Connor, who firmly said he was calm and stepped inside. When Connor confronted Madison, her usual smirk disappeared from her face. What are you even doing here? I have nothing to say to you. Madison's sudden outburst startled the baby, who began to cry. While Connor tried to discuss serious matters, I offered to hold the baby to calm things down. Don't you dare touch my baby, you peasant. Madison glared at me as she shouted, which only made the baby cry louder. Even in a situation like this, Madison couldn't resist looking down on me, and I was completely fed up. Sandra took the baby and managed to calm him down, prompting Connor to coldly address Madison. Don't act so high and mighty when you're the one who had a child with someone else. You keep bragging about being part of an elite family. Don't you feel any shame? Connor's outburst silenced Madison for a moment, but she quickly fired back. You're right that you're not the baby's biological father, but legally it's yours. As the father on paper, you're responsible for paying child support. Madison clearly knew that the baby wasn't Connor's biological child from the start. Connor had already told me about the affair, so I wasn't surprised, but I couldn't imagine how shocking the situation must be for him. As I tried to comprehend the twisted logic of these so-called elites, Connor grew even more furious. Don't worry about the child. I've already worked things out with your affair partner. What I want is for you to apologize to me. Right now. Even as Connor demanded an apology, Madison refused to lower her head. Why on earth should someone from an elite family like me apologize to the son of a small-town banker? If anything, it's your fault for not noticing I was having an affair. Listening to Madison's selfish excuses made my blood boil. I couldn't understand how she could remain so arrogant when she was clearly in the wrong. Connor, visibly shaking with anger, seemed to realize that no amount of reasoning would get through to Madison. Sandra, let's discuss alimony and what happens next, since Madison clearly won't. Also, what exactly happened to the house? Connor directed his questions to Sandra, who was still holding the baby. Sandra seemed to ignore him entirely, offering no response. I, too, was curious about what had happened to their family home. Did something happen to your home? Does it have anything to do with you and Madison suddenly showing up here? Sandra remained silent despite my questions, so I turned to Ethan for answers instead. Did you decide to look after them here since they can no longer live in their own home? And what exactly happened to their house? I spoke firmly, but Ethan fidgeted nervously, refusing to give me a straight answer. Judging from Ethan and Sandra's reactions, it was clear they couldn't stay at their house anymore. It was Madison who confirmed my suspicions with a laugh. Why don't you just tell her the truth already? The house has been foreclosed. I was stunned by how casually Madison said it, as if it were no big deal. She laughed about the foreclosure of the house she used to brag about, and I couldn't help but wonder if she was okay mentally. On top of that, Connor had found out about her affair, and she'd openly admitted that her baby's father was her affair partner. It made me question if all these shocks had finally caused her to lose her sense of reality. Why was the house and property foreclosed? It doesn't really matter to me since I'm divorcing Ethan, but I'd still like to know. I asked Ethan directly, but he just looked down and stayed silent. After a long, awkward silence, Madison cheerfully broke the tension. It's because Mom and Ethan were reckless with their money. Mom got swindled in some investment scam, and Ethan's been funneling money to his mistress. I was shocked to hear Sandra had fallen for a scam, but learning Ethan had been funding an affair left me utterly speechless. I had assumed Madison was the only one cheating, never Ethan. Madison, what the hell are you talking about? You promised not to say anything about my affair. Ethan, who had been quiet until now, suddenly shouted. Madison, unbothered by Ethan's anger, responded gleefully. It's not fair that I'm the only one who gets blamed for cheating. Besides, Maggie already agreed to the divorce, so there's no harm in spilling the beans now. For the first time, I felt grateful for Madison's loose lips. I had already decided to leave, but knowing about Ethan's affair would strengthen my case for alimony. Ethan seemed to realize this too and scrambled to deny it. She's lying. I haven't been cheating. Madison's just confusing her own affair with mine. Madison burst into laughter at Ethan's weak attempt to deny it. You kept saying that you had to help out with a campaign every time you went out, and it was the same lame excuse every single time. Even Maggie must have suspected you were cheating. I mean, your behavior was super suspicious. Madison was right. I had been doubting Ethan's story about helping with a political campaign. But Madison wasn't on my side in this. She even seemed to enjoy my irritation as she gleefully shared more secrets. Ethan gets bored so easily. He started cheating not long after you got married. He even asked me and Mom for advice on how to get you to leave. Ethan didn't want to pay alimony, so he had Sandra and Madison torment me, hoping I'd file for divorce myself. That's why he dragged me to family gatherings, where Sandra and Madison would hurl insults at me. At the time, they didn't know their house was about to be foreclosed. Once the house was gone and they had nowhere to go, Sandra and Madison showed up at my place, demanding I take care of them. Ethan and Sandra's shock at my decision to leave wasn't because they cared. They just realized they'd lose their free housekeeper. Ethan's mistress doesn't want to take care of us, apparently. I mean, who would agree to take care of a demanding mother-in-law and sister-in-law out of nowhere? Madison's detached tone left me speechless. Connor let out a heavy sigh before stepping in to speak. You're planning to dump the baby's care on someone else too, aren't you? Don't you have any sense of responsibility as a mother? Madison simply laughed in response to Connor's pointed questions. At that moment, Sandra, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. Maggie, you understand the situation now, don't you? You should stay here and take care of us. I understood the situation perfectly, but I still couldn't fathom why I had to be the one to take care of them. Like I said earlier, I'm leaving this marriage and this house. I understand you're in a tough spot, but you'll have to figure it out yourselves. When I said that, Sandra started shouting about how ungrateful I was and how it was my duty to care for them after everything they'd done for me. I ignored Sandra's ranting and turned my glare to Ethan. If Madison hadn't spilled the beans, I wouldn't have known to demand alimony. You and your mistress are going to pay me every cent I'm owed. After firmly telling Ethan, I picked up my bags and prepared to leave the house. As Ethan begged me not to leave, Sandra interjected. You don't need to beg someone as lowly as her. Ethan can just find another wife, someone better suited for our family. I almost laughed out loud. The audacity of someone who just lost their home to foreclosure was astounding. You're right. Next time, find a wife from your so-called elite circles. Oh, and make sure she's willing to take care of you, Madison, and the baby too. Madison burst into laughter at my sarcasm, while Sandra's face turned bright red with fury. She clearly couldn't stand being called out by someone she deemed beneath her. How dare a lowly commoner like you speak to me that way? I should have opposed Ethan marrying you from the start. Looking at her furious face, I thought maybe she should have. In the end, it would have saved me all this trouble. I never imagined Ethan would cheat on me when I married him, but in hindsight, I wished someone had stopped us. As Sandra and I glared at each other, Madison butted in. No point in dwelling on the past now. The real question is, what are you going to do from here? I can't do housework, so Mom, you'll have to handle that and the baby. Sandra, now furious with Madison's lack of responsibility, turned her anger toward her daughter. Take care of your own child for once. I don't want to do housework either, and it's exhausting taking care of a baby. Connor, growing increasingly fed up with both of them, addressed them coldly. There's no way I'd trust either of you with raising a child. I spoke to Madison's affair partner. He's agreed to take full custody of the baby. It seemed Connor had been in touch with Madison's affair partner and was already making plans for the baby's future. Hearing Connor's words, both Madison and Sandra looked oddly relieved. As someone without children, I couldn't understand how they could possibly be happy to lose custody of the baby. That would actually be great. I'm exhausted after just 3 months of being a mom. Listening to Madison, I realized the baby would indeed be better off with her affair partner. Madison looked visibly relieved, while Connor appeared utterly disappointed. Your affair partner's wife is going to demand alimony, and trust me, so am I. Of course, I'm filing for damages too. Madison's relaxed demeanor quickly vanished at the mention of alimony. Although Connor had already told her about his claims, Madison hadn't anticipated her affair partner's wife would also demand compensation. You can't get alimony from someone who has no money, so I guess it'll be Mom or Ethan that will pay it on my behalf. Hearing Madison's reliance on others, I couldn't resist pointing out the obvious. Your mom lost the house. How is she going to pay alimony? And Ethan has to pay me alimony too, so he's out of the picture. Even as I said it, I assumed Sandra and Ethan would find some way to scrape together the money. Still, Madison's attitude irritated me, and I decided to scare her a little. I glanced at Ethan and saw that his face had gone pale. Sandra, too, was silent, making me wonder if they really were out of money. As Maggie said, it doesn't seem like Sandra or Ethan can afford to cover Madison's alimony. Isn't that right? Confronted by Connor, both Ethan and Sandra avoided answering. Connor had done his homework and knew about their financial struggles. Sandra had been in debt even before the scam and had hoped to strike it rich with risky investments to pay it all back. That's when the scammer targeted her. She borrowed money using the family home as collateral, but when she couldn't pay it back, her debts only deepened. And because of their extravagant spending, Sandra, Ethan, and Madison quickly burned through the substantial inheritance left by Sandra's late husband. It seemed they had been throwing money around recklessly just to keep up appearances. Ethan didn't seem wasteful at first glance, but it turns out that he had been given large sums to his mistress. When his salary wasn't enough, Sandra stepped in to cover the difference, which only added to her debts. Knowing about Ethan's affair, Sandra and Madison joined forces to pressure me into filing for divorce on my own. Their plan was working until they lost their assets, something they hadn't anticipated. Now that I think about it, making me handle family gatherings wasn't just spiteful. They couldn't afford to hire help anymore. I thought making me handle the family events was just harassment. Turns out it was because you couldn't afford to pay a housekeeper. When I asked, Sandra quietly admitted that it was convenient. It allowed her to save money while also tormenting me. With that mystery solved, I prepared to leave the house once and for all. But first, I remembered there was something I needed to tell Ethan. I've been covering the utility bills lately, but from now on, they're all yours. The bills had been set to withdraw from Ethan's account, but he has stopped depositing money into it. I had asked him multiple times, but he brushed me off saying, I pay the rent, don't I? But the apartment had been bought outright with his father's money. There was no rent to pay. Maggie, can't you reconsider? You'll end up being laughed at by everyone after the divorce. Ethan seemed terrified of losing face, but I had nothing to be ashamed of. Don't worry about that now. You never once stood up for me when Sandra and Madison insulted me, did you? I knew it was pointless to say, but I couldn't help myself. Not wanting to drag this out any further, I grabbed my bags and left the house. I'll be back soon to pick up the rest of my things, and I'll bring the divorce papers for you to sign. Ethan shouted, "Wait," as I walked out, but I ignored him and kept going. They must have assumed that, with no family of my own, I'd have nowhere else to go. But luckily, a close friend let me stay at her place. When I told her about the divorce, she was shocked. When I added the details about Ethan and Madison's affairs and the foreclosure of their family home, she couldn't believe her ears. For a family that was so proud of their elite status, this fall from grace is just karma. I planned to pick up the rest of my things over the weekend, but when I called Ethan, his phone was disconnected. I figured he was angry and ignoring my calls on purpose, so I decided to head over to the apartment anyway. I knew Sandra and Madison were likely still there, so I braced myself to face them. Before, I'd have dreaded seeing them, but knowing I was officially leaving Ethan, I didn't care anymore. In fact, I was a little curious about how they were getting by. When I got to the apartment, the door was locked, so I used my spare key to get in. As I stepped inside, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. There was no sign of anyone. It seemed like Ethan and the others weren't home. I checked around and was relieved to see that my belongings were still there. Everything looked the same as the day I left, making me wonder what had happened. After moving some things, I remembered the divorce papers and realized I still needed Ethan's signature. Since Ethan's phone was still disconnected, I decided to call Connor instead. Do you have any idea where Ethan and the others went? His phone's disconnected and he's not at the apartment either. Connor, sounding uneasy, explained what had happened. It looks like Ethan and Madison ran off in the middle of the night. I haven't been able to contact them either. I even checked with his workplace. They said that he hasn't shown up to the office for days, and that they haven't been able to reach him. I was stunned by what Connor told me. I knew their family home had been foreclosed and that they were drowning in debt, but I never imagined they'd resort to skipping town. With Ethan gone, I realized I might not be able to finalize the divorce. Noticing my distress, Connor told me he has something important. Ethan had already signed the divorce papers. When Madison and I finalized our divorce papers, I had Ethan fill out his at the same time. Looking back, I'm glad I insisted on getting his signature then. Connor hadn't anticipated Ethan running away, but he'd pushed for the signature knowing Ethan might otherwise stall. He lied to Ethan, saying that signing would help smooth things over and make negotiating alimony easier. Of course, I had no intention of reducing the alimony, but Ethan had fallen for Connor's story, likely out of desperation. It was clear now just how far this once proud elite family had fallen. Thanks to Connor, I finally felt relieved knowing I could move forward with the divorce. What about Madison's baby? She didn't take the baby with her, did she? Now that my own situation was sorted, I couldn't help but worry about the baby. Before she disappeared, Madison left the baby with her affair partner. She must have remembered that during our last confrontation, I said her affair partner was willing to take custody. The guy promised he'd take responsibility and raise the child himself. Of course, the affair partner's wife wasn't happy, and it caused a lot of trouble in their household. But when he said he'd take the baby in, his wife reluctantly agreed. They didn't have kids of their own, and had apparently been considering adoption before this. Although she couldn't forgive the affair, she likely decided raising his biological child was the best option. If I were in her shoes, I wouldn't know what to do either, but it did seem like the best choice for the baby. You've been through a lot too, Connor. But how did you figure out the baby wasn't yours? Curious, I asked, and Connor explained that the baby's blood type made it impossible for it to be his. On top of that, Connor had long suspected Madison's behavior and had already been wary of her cheating. It's pathetic that I let Madison cheat on me. I had my suspicions, but couldn't stop her from continuing. Hearing his words, I realized I felt the same way. Even though I had my doubts about Ethan, I never confronted him seriously, which only allowed his affair to go on. Sensing the mood getting heavier, I decided to change the subject. Where do you think Ethan and the others ran off to? Were their debts really that bad? Connor didn't know all the details, but apparently Sandra had borrowed money from some shady sources. Manipulated by scammers, Sandra had taken on high-interest loans. She likely fled out of fear of relentless debt collectors. Connor worried about Ethan, who had been skipping work, hoping he wasn't involved in anything dangerous. I didn't say it out loud, but part of me hoped Ethan and his family would face the consequences of their actions. They claimed to be part of an elite family while cheating and deceiving both me and Connor. Despite bragging about their wealth, they were buried in debt and ended up fleeing in shame. As my friend has said, it was all karma. Ethan would probably lose his job at the big company, but did he ever stop to think about how this would reflect his coworkers? But maybe Ethan had bragged about his elite status at work too, which might explain why people wouldn't miss him. I thought Sandra could have asked her relatives for help with the debts, but according to Connor, Sandra and her family had been shunned by their relatives. During the New Year's gatherings, their relatives had clearly been annoyed by the way Sandra and Madison treated me. They learned the hard way that in today's world, bragging about being part of an elite family only alienates people. A few weeks after the divorce, I was hanging out with a friend when a shocking piece of news came to my attention. "Maggie, look at this. You're not going to believe it." My friend handed me her phone to show me the screen. The screen displayed a news article about a group of American nationals arrested overseas on fraud charges. One of the arrested individuals shared Ethan's exact name. No way. Could this really be Ethan? Look at the photo. Doesn't that look exactly like him? The article included mugshots, and sure enough, one of them was unmistakably Ethan. I was left speechless, realizing my ex-husband had fallen so far that he ended up as a con artist arrested overseas. I called Connor to talk about the news, and it turned out he had seen it too. "Maggie, did you see the news? I recognized that face right away. There's no mention of Sandra or Madison in the reports, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're involved in something shady too. It's just pathetic. They always bragged so much about how privileged they were, and this is where they end up. It's karma, plain and simple." Talking with Connor helped me feel a little less overwhelmed. Later, Connor invited me to dinner and I agreed to meet him. We talked about our past marriages and what we wanted for our futures. We've both been through tough times, but we can bounce back. Maggie, you're one of the strongest people I know. Thanks, Connor. You're just as strong. The more we talked, I realized I was starting to feel drawn to Connor. It seemed he felt the same way, and we made plans to meet again. After being betrayed by Ethan, I thought I'd never date again, but my perspective was starting to shift. I didn't know where things would go, but for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful about starting a new chapter in my life.